Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have psychologist Dr. Ido Cohen. Join us for a conversation about integrating new archetypes of sexual empowerment. Together we talk about reconnecting with your wild eros, getting clear on your desires, and the vulnerability of play. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy. I am so delighted to have all of you pleasure activists from around the world tuning in for another episode each Wednesday. My name is Nicole. I am a sex and relationship psychotherapist with training in psychedelic integration therapy. And I am also the founder of the Pleasure Practice, supporting individuals in crafting expansive sex lives and intimate relationships. Dear listener, it really is such a joy to produce this podcast for you, dear listener, every week. To sit down with my computer and to create this very special space for you. Dr. Ido Cohen and I talk about the power of culture, how it shapes who we are, what we desire, the concept of self that we have, and dear listener, I just can't even tell you what a paradigm shift it has been when I reflect back on the last 10 years of my life to go from a space where my friends used to say, hey, it's a Saturday night, our church is getting together for a Bible reading where we can sit and talk about the Lord, to a world where I'm getting texts from my friends about queer sex play parties. Hey, do you want to come with me? Sounds like it's going to be a great night. We could watch and get to see the whole world out there. And it's just such a paradigm shift. Let me tell you, as someone who has put their existence into both of those boxes, the conversations are different. And the sense of self, even the breath of the orgasm from that religious space to the play space has been quite a transformation. Dr. Ido Cohen and I talk about death and rebirths, and let me tell you, there have been so many deaths and rebirths that have been messy and painful and confusing, to be very clear, and that is why I'm so passionate about this work of getting to support people in this, because our culture doesn't talk about pleasure. Our culture doesn't talk about liberation. Our culture definitely doesn't talk about sexual play. And I can promise you, dear listener, I will continue to be in this space to talk about it and to explore with you and to continue to integrate these supposedly two sides, right? The slutty and the divine, the Madonna and the whore. Because truly, I don't know what is more divine than to be in your body and to feel the power of your sanctity and that ecstatic expression of pleasure. I hope you can continue to step deeper and deeper into your purity, into your play, into your reclamation. All right, dear listener, if you are ready to liberate your pleasure, you can explore my offerings and resources at modernanarchypodcast.com, linked in the show notes below. And I want to say the biggest thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. You are supporting the long-term sustainability of the podcast, keeping this content free and accessible for all people. So thank you. If you want to join the Patreon community, get exclusive access into my research and personal exploration, then you can head on over to patreon.com/modernanarchy. also linked in the show notes below. And with that, dear listener, please know that I am sending you all my love. And let's tune in to today's episode. So then the first question I like to ask each guest is, how would you introduce yourself to the listeners?
First, thank you for having me, Nicole. My name is Ido Cohen. I am a human.
Yeah, I love that.
To start there,
Yep.
I am an immigrant. I'm passionate about psychospiritual human development and integration and the intersection of that with human relationships and intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And how is that being done in community? So not just on the level of the individual or the dyad. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work out of the Bay Area, mostly with early childhood emotional trauma, as well as psychedelic education, psychedelic psychotherapy education, and facilitation. But focused on the integration part. So how do we take any big life experience and make it into long-term, sustainable, embodied change?
Yeah, the narrative of that journey.
Narrative, the path and narrative, yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you in this space. Yeah, and I know before we started, you had mentioned that in preparing for the podcast, you were talking to some people about pieces that are inhibiting women's sexuality.
Yes, yeah.
I'd love to hear more about that 3-hour conversation you had last night.
Sure. This was in preparation for our conversation.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about, I'm telling them that I'm going to be on your podcast. And for some reason, the question that came for me is to kind of go into, I think, the heart of the matter, which is what are the things that impact women's embodiment of sexuality?
Mm-hmm.
And sexuality, obviously, not just being sex, but also sexual expression, how you carry yourself in the world.
Right.
The three main points were, can I trust the other to hold my fantasies, but also my vulnerability?
Mm-hmm.
And the impact of sexual trauma, feeling on expressing sexuality and how that comes. And I think the third thing was and shame. Right? The fear, the shame and rejection, that really lethal pair.
Yeah.
If I tell you who I am, what I want, my inhibitions, what prevents me from being fully embodied, fully expressed, will you reject me? Will you shame me? Will you reject me? Will you tell me something is wrong with me?
Yeah.
So those would be the big three, and which obviously I think we can have a full podcast on each one of them.
Absolutely.
But one of the things I took is the intensity of this idea of risk versus safety. Doesn't mean to be safe in a relationship. Shame is always going to be there, right? Shame is always going to be there in some extent. And how do we even know that we feel safe? How would I know that I feel safe? How would I tell you what I need for safety? When is it time to take a risk? Is it okay for you to ask me to take a risk? One of the things we were talking about is how, for myself, in order to trust you, I need to feel you're taking a risk with me. So I need the vulnerability to feel trust.
Right.
For someone else at the table was like, he said, well, I'm the opposite. I need to trust you before I can take risks.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, that dance between the two.
Exactly, right? So how do we do these dances consciously when we come into a relationship? And then we're always relating. I always say this, right? We're always in relationship. You're either relating to yourself, or you're relating to an object, or you're relating to a person, or you're relating to a social structure, you're always in relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we always get the opportunity to examine our relationship.
Yeah, it was interesting. As you were talking about shame, I was like, I don't feel it anymore. Like, I just don't. I don't know.
Yeah.
But then I was thinking
How did you get there?
Jesus, this podcast space, many orgasms and lovers and difficult conversations with my parents, having this space here and being like, this is what I do. And this is, I continue to release shame about bodily sounds or other things, but God, like these days, I really don't feel as much of that. I feel so like I'm in my
Mm,
body. This is what
mm,
divine, this is holy. And if you're in relationship with me, then you have this gift of being present with me, and you're
mm.
lucky to be present with me. There is no shame in that, right? And the
Wow.
humanness, but as I was saying that, I was like, it's still definitely there, right? I get afraid of mostly going into other spaces where that level of acceptance isn't okay, where I have to like double think of like, can I even name this pleasurable experience I had, or is that going to make someone uncomfortable or push them too far? Or what are they going to think? So the shame is definitely still there. It's not, I think,
Exactly.
it's inescapable in some ways, but I think that it's been such a journey to, particularly, I would say, if we're thinking about psychology and our mental health, it's the community, right? Going
Hmm.
from being in a world for me where my best friends were getting married to pastors.
Mm.
Not to say that you can't have sexual liberation and freedom and shameless sex in that space, but I think it's very different. There is
Sure.
a lot of shaming in that space to a space where, I'm sitting around at a table with my friends and they're like, "Oh, what's your sexual fantasies?" And I'm like, "Huh,
Mm.
okay," and you start talking about it, and how much that normalizes your experience in some ways, which I hope is some of the power of the podcast, right? We have all these different conversations talking about it,
Mm.
talking about these things that are so quote unquote taboo to hopefully lift some of that. But as you were talking, I was also thinking, you do a lot of work with archetypes, right?
Mhm.
Just
Mhm.
the narratives around women's sexuality, right? And what is
Oh yeah.
possible. And if we look to the media and these stories, it's just so restricted. I was even watching The Golden Bachelor, getting into that, right? And for research, of course, but it is because it
It's
is.
always for research. It's always for
Exactly. But just even having these images of women in their 60s and 70s presenting as erotic beings, embarking upon this journey. Where in what rom-com have I been able to look
mm,
to see that as an example? Where do I see that in porn? And I'm just so sick of the male gaze in porn, right? So it's just like we culturally need a whole new narrative to look
absolutely.
to. Otherwise, we're just trying to fit
Absolutely.
into these boxes that have left us with the orgasm gap and other stuff like that. Ugh.
Well, you said so many good things. I think maybe a good place to start is you said erotic, right? So just starting with the idea of what's eros, if we're talking archetypes,
Mm-hmm.
right? And eros has been relegated to either 50 Shades of Grey or sex or something. When eros is right, in the old mythological roots of it, eros is like chi. It's like prana. It's like
Mm,
varka. Every one of those big traditions have their idea of life force for right the Greek mythology was eros. It was that life energy. So right, part of our job is to, I think what you named is how do we work throughout in blogs to let eros really take over and be expressed through us. And
mm-hmm.
that can be through art, and it can be through an orgasm, and it can be through a very deep, intimate conversation with friends over
Mm-hmm.
dinner. It can be so many ways,
Right.
right? But we are, like you said, we have all these social, we have to start with the fact, right, that we're all basically sandwiched by these really intense collective energies, right, that tell us how we should be. We start with
Right.
patriarchy, gender roles, identity roles, religion, what's
Right.
being moral, what does it mean to be moral, right?
Right.
So we already start with that, and we're all always kind of sandwiched in that
Mm-hmm.
unconsciously,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
From the moment you choose your clothes in the morning, right?
Yep.
How many of us stand there and be like, what would be my most eros expressive outfit of the day? Like,
I
right?
try.
We don't think. I bow there, right? But you're probably very unique, right? Most of us think of like, okay,
Yeah.
what's acceptable? I'm going to
Right.
a
Right. Right.
meeting.
Right.
What would they like?
Right. Totally. I'd have to do that.
What's
Yes.
presentable?
Yes.
So we're already in that level. And then on top of it, you have your personal, the stuff you carry from high school around sexuality, if you had religious trauma or attachment to it. So we have the collective and then we have the personal. And that's what we hang out with all the time, unconsciously, right? So when we get to those moments, like I love your friends who are like, hey, what's your sexual fantasy, right? So when we get to that moment, someone offers it. I think it's for a lot of us, it can feel like you're walking into a minefield. It's like, oh
Mm.
my God, what is the thing I'm going to say that's going to trigger some kind of landmine, and then shame, fear, rejection, right? And we're saying it like it's something small, but it's actually petrifying.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Uh-huh. It reminds me of the in therapy we have the emotion wheel.
Hmm.
Eroticism, pleasure, and particularly sex is a whole area that people have no language for. We have all these different feelings, sorts of things going up in our head, but to be able to express what's your fantasy, how do you like to be touched? Where do you want to go in our play today? That is like
Hmm.
asking someone to name an emotion that they have no idea about. And so I think part of the problem is that we just don't even have language to these things because it's such a, you don't talk about that. That's
Exactly.
private. That's private. So then we don't have the language formation.
Well, it's private and and again, it's so precious and it's risky.
Mm,
I remember this story is coming to mind also. I remember about like 7 years ago, I was doing laundry
sure.
and I was seeing someone in my building that I don't usually know, and I was like, "Hey, can I help you?" I thought she was lost, and he's like, "Oh no, I actually am renting an art studio. Doesn't matter." From here, we started talking, and she's like, "Oh, I'm moving to Israel. Now I'm Israeli."
Hmm.
And I was like, "Why would you do that? Like, what's your interest in moving to Israel?" And she said, "Well, I've been to Midburn, which is the Israeli version of Burning Man, and the artistic community." And then she told me this really interesting story. She said, when I went to the Midburn, I had so many people ask me, what do I want?
Ha.
And she's like, even the men there, I would hang out with them. And then eventually he'll be like, so, hey, you're being really flirtatious. And like, what do you want? And she said it with, actually, she started getting teary. She's like, I've never been asked that question so much in my life. And
Hmm.
it was such a potent moment because I was like, yeah, I've heard these stories from clients of mine in indirect ways. Nobody really asks you about these big taboo questions, topics like sexuality, for example. What do you want?
Hmm.
One of the people in the dinner yesterday, she said, I don't know anything about my parents' sex. How was it for my mom to birth me? Right? So most of us are born into families that already carry that mark of shame and secrecy.
Hmm.
So when someone like you comes and offers us the door, it's like, hey, do you want to like come out of that chamber of, of that chamber of shame and secrecy? It's like, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, wait, what? It's okay for me to tell you what I want. It's
Hmm.
okay for me. Let's make it more extreme, right? It's okay for me to be in middle intercourse and then all of a sudden actually something really painful is coming up for me. Is it
Oh,
okay
yeah.
for me to share that? We're supposed to be having sex, right? Sex is
Right.
supposed to be about pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm even just saying that I'm remembering like the first time that I was having sex with someone and asked them to stop because it was painful and like how much of a
Mm.
journey that was just to get that out of my mouth
Mm.
and say, hey, I think I want to stop. And that was what, years into having sex. And I think I blame a
Ah.
lot of that on my purity culture situation, right? And all
Mm.
of that sort of complexity. And so, yeah, just getting that out there, which it breaks my heart to think about that, right? Because it should be about
Mm.
pleasure and enjoyment and the connection and such a world where, again, if we're particularly talking about women, right, this world of people pleasing in all areas of
Hmm.
life, let
Yeah,
alone
absolutely.
sexuality, let alone what I was taught was that I was supposed to submit to the authority of my husband and that
Right.
I'm supposed to give my body to him. So it's already negating my ownership over my body and my pleasure so that when
Hmm.
we have sex and it starts to hurt, well, this is for him and I'm giving him this. Oh my
Mm.
God, Ugh. And
Right. So,
yeah.
which is, I guess I have a question because you are touching on a big archetype for women's sexuality, which is to be the pure, right? The virgin, the sacred virgin, right? How much of that is embedded in women just by being born?
It's everywhere.
Every, say
Everywhere.
more.
Oh my God, are you kidding me? It's everywhere. Who wants to buy the cow if you can already get the milk, right? That dumb
Mm.
bullshit, sort of mentality that like, if you're giving out sex, no one's actually gonna want you. Again, coming from purity culture, right? The first time I had sex, I sobbed because it was before marriage. This is how I ended up in
Mm.
the Midwest. You follow the person you do that with. And so
Ah, okay.
God, I remember the first time I had sex, I sobbed uncontrollably in my bathroom floor because I felt like I had ruined the one thing and that no one would ever want me.
Mm.
Right. And so having sex with a second person in my lifetime, I was like, God, I'm such a whore, like I'm so dirty. And then having sex with two people at the same time and polyamory and having sex with two people in the same room. I was like, oh my God, I'm such a slut, you know? Like, so there's just so
Mm,
many ways that I think there are cultural scripts, right? Because some people didn't have that experience that I had in my bathroom floor crying because they weren't taught this world of only one person for life. And so I think a
mhm,
lot of this, we just can't ever really, like anything else in life of the psychology, we can't take this out of the cultural container and the cultural scripts that provide narratives of what this stimulus means, like the meaning making from this act and how
mhm.
deeply laden that is for all of us in not just religion, but the culture, every single movie, all this. It gets very subtly said in these little side comments. I was watching the Netflix series Principles of Pleasure, which is really good on this and hits some sort of points where you can see all of this unfolding. And it particularly takes a lens to women's pleasure as a discussion here, and just the ways that, yeah, even outside of the scripts of religion, women have been taught to give, women have been taught, you know, we're either the Madonna or the whore, right?
Right.
And you fuck one and marry the other, and you can't have both.
That's painful, right? That's painful because
Yeah.
that's consciousness that's asking women to split, right? Repress and oppress your inner Lilith, your whore, right?
Yeah.
Your wild woman,
Yeah.
and glorify and idealize the virgin mother archetype in you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you are. And we all know how that ends up, right? Midlife crisis,
Right.
or an affair,
Right.
or years of depression, or all the good stuff that comes with splitting your personality.
Mm-hmm.
That's so powerful. I think this is where it gets juicy for me because I'm like, oh, but that's, I'm Jungian in the sense of Jung's idea of love is the dynamism that brings the unconscious to light.
Mm.
So what if sex is not about pleasure? What if intimacy is not about pleasure? What if intimacy and sex are about opening space for eros to do its thing? And today it's going to be pleasure, and tomorrow we're gonna fight, and then the next day we're gonna process the shit out of your childhood trauma, and then the other day we're just gonna play. We're gonna feed each other fruit, or I don't know what
Mm-hmm.
it is, right? Every time it
Yeah.
changes. And what if we really, when I work with couples, I see how much. First of all, it's interesting, and I'll be curious to hear
Yeah.
your thought. Sex is maybe the last thing that comes in, and it's fascinating to me because when we do start talking about sex, I see the metaphor for the entire relationship,
Oh yeah.
all the power dynamics, what's being acted out, it all funnels into that place, right? Into sex.
Mm-hmm.
What if there's an idea that conscious sexuality, and again, it's not just the sexual act, is about letting go of all our ideas of what that means and actually coming into an open space of allowing things to happen. Now, it doesn't mean we can't have an intention. It doesn't mean we can't want to be like, okay, today we're like, let's play. I really want to play with you. And
Mm-hmm.
as we're playing, you're going to tell me what you like, and I'm going to tell you what I like. We're gonna, or whatever, right? We're going to explore kink or whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay if something else enters. So nothing gets shamed, nothing gets split off.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay? You're naming women's wound, and I want to advocate also for men.
Right.
A lot, right? Men come into sexuality with a whole other set of baggage, right? Patriarchy did a number on us too.
Yeah.
You're supposed to always perform.
Yeah.
You don't. There's something really messed up with your masculinity as a
Mm-hmm.
whole. In a way, you're supposed to be selfish, but you're also supposed to be the lover. And it's about your pleasure, not her pleasure. You're supposed to make her feel pleasure because then you'll feel good about yourself. And then there's the whole idea of God forbid you show anything other than hypermasculinity in the bedroom or sexuality. God forbid, and it's interesting. I have a colleague named Mikey, and he really talks about how many men have early sexual trauma that never
Mm.
gets spoken about.
Yeah.
And it walks with them in their sexuality throughout all their life. And men don't talk about that.
Right.
And I know for a fact it's as dangerous to talk about it with a partner, a female partner, than it is with a guy friend. And so we're constantly, you're right, we're living in this culture that it's constantly asking us to split off that part of yourself, split off that pain, split off your power, right? Don't be the sacred whore. Like, don't bring your goddess, sexual goddess self into the bedroom or into sexuality. That might be too much for him, or it's too much for you, right? Because you can't be a mother and a whore.
Right.
I read this article piece about how I think it was a group of women wrote of how their first experience about the moment they became mothers, they could feel that society has made them asexual.
Yeah.
And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm maybe even hornier than what I was before. Like, why are we living in a place that the moment I birth a baby, right? And again, it's that archetype. It's the way that archetype lives inside of all of us.
Hmm. Which makes me ask like such deeper questions about free will, you know, because I'm just like
Same.
you know, like so many of these questions are of like, oh, this is my personality, this is who I am, this is my personality, this is my identity, and it's like so tricky when all of those pieces are shaped by our relationships, right? To family, to friends, and the larger culture, right? So to have that moment where you become the mom and then have that immediate shut off, right? I don't know if that's as much of an internal experience as much as, like you said, an external pressure on us that we're all feeling. And so I just it's interesting in this like hyper identity culture. We're asking these questions of who am I? How do I respond? And I think we're kind of forgetting the like maybe larger quantum mechanics nature of the always in flux with our environment. And it's never just this silo atom that's functioning on its own. And so it
Hmm.
is heartbreaking because yes, the patriarchy has really done a number on all people, right? And
All
just god damn, like just thinking about all these different thoughts that are going up here, all these different thoughts when there's a world of pleasure, intimacy, sensation and connection on the other side. And it my heart aches knowing what a large part of the psyche this is that so many people are suffering from. I remember
people.
reading Irving Yalom's book on group therapy, and he was just
Hmm.
talking about how, like, I forget what the first two things were, but the top three things that people come in with pain points around, one of them being sex. And I remember just reading that in my class, being like, yep, this is why I'm about to do what I'm about to do because this is crazy, right? Just so much suffering in the world because of all of this that God damn, if we could just take like a deep breath into our humanness, into our pleasure, what a different world politically it would
Mm.
be.
One of the people in the dinner we were at, she brought up Dr. Ruth,
Yeah,
right? Because apparently one of Dr. Ruth's like hidden agendas was to promote world peace through sexuality. She said if people
I'm
can liberate
here.
their sexuality,
Yeah,
and it's very, if you think about it, it's very Freudian, right? Because Freud said that war, aggression, death, and sexuality all belong in the same center. So in a way, if you liberate one, potentially you're liberating all of them. Right.
hmm,
So she was doing this like sneaky, pun not intended, backdoor thing where she's like, oh, okay, I'll be this like cute grandma who's like talking about sex all the time and in a
yeah,
non-threat. You can't be threatened by her. She just
right,
looked like such, but she just spoke about it in a way that both triggered your shame, but also made you like wanna, like you said, liberate it, normalize it.
sure. Hmm.
And how much of that is really helping us liberate. And I think I love what you said, Nicole, because I think people don't really, I live in California where it's the movement of liberation is very prominent, let's say
Right,
it like that. And I don't feel that people really acknowledge the impact of culture. I think even living, if you live in San Francisco, which is like the bubble within the bubble within the bubble, well, you're very much shaped. Even pushing culture away is still a reaction to culture. It's not a choice. You're not really deconstructing and disintegrating the way in which culture lives inside of you to come up for that like free will, like you said. You're just being reactive, which in a way, not in a way, you're still controlled by culture. You
right,
just think you're.
right.
And I think this is where it gets interesting as far as having conscious relationships, having intimacy practice, what I call emotionally poly relationships, right? Friends of yours that you process with, and stuff like psychedelics and therapy, right? Because that's where we have these agents that can get in there and really help us make that do what you were saying. Like, how do I start extracting culture from within me? How do I
Hmm.
start that disintegration process? I get space from my pain and my shame so I can be in a reflective space, actually, to be like, okay, how did my childhood trauma, sexual trauma, still impacting me? How can I name it? Is it okay? I worked with a pretty big group of women who, and again, I'm sure men, but men just don't say it,
Right.
who had sexual trauma. And most of them just want to get rid of that. Like, I don't want that girl anymore in my life because she's carrying all that pain. And enter psychedelics, and I've worked with hundreds of people with psychedelic experiences. And that girl comes back, and all of a sudden, this insight of like, oh, actually, I have to really connect with her. I interviewed someone who was interesting. She had cancer in her abdomen, and she was doing both chemo, but at the same time doing like pretty intensive plant medicine process.
Mhm.
And she had this experience where she saw how being a girl who was vibrant and wild, again, here's that word,
Mhm.
but also very creative, was continuously criticized and shut down in her family. In her process, and you could feel it when she was talking about it. She was talking about reclaiming her, again, sexuality, not just sex, the act, but sexuality as an expression of eros.
Right.
So she began to like take on all these creative pieces, which was movement and dancing. And she started, growling playfully at people and
Yes.
like invite them into that energy. And she
Mhm.
said, it's fascinating because all of a sudden my partner is scared. He likes the more tame version of me, but this version he's not really into. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
And I have to be this version. This is who I am, right? So for her, having that kind of very deep reflective process, but using psychedelics for it really allowed that to kind of say like, hey, here's years of, shame and early childhood pain that you're
Right.
carrying. And if you have to do something.
Yeah, how painful, right? For that person to hit that
Mm-hmm.
moment of connecting with her wild, eros and to have that threat of disconnection with the partner, right? Oof, what a pain point. And, that's the relational paradox right there of do you stay and cut off the parts of yourself or do you, leave? And oh, how painful. And then the reverse is obviously that, women will see a man cry and then be unattracted to him
Right.
because he's weak, right? So it's not like women are off the table on this thing. Again, we've all been
No.
impacted by those structures. And so it is in our psyche. It's like other forms of oppression that we have to
Mm-hmm.
take that active, like shovel in and like scoop out and work to acknowledge like, wow, I'm having this reaction where I'm unattracted to you because you're crying, and that's not okay. I'm having the reaction and we're going to work with that. We're not going to run away from that. We need to actually scoop that out. But yeah, the power of psychedelics to get into that space of vulnerability, to slow down that default mode network, to slow down the manager parts if we want to do IFS,
Mm-hmm.
just to come back. And I think part of what I'm also interested in learning more about with psychedelics as we continue in this movement is the somatic pieces of it. Like, forget the psyche,
Mm-hmm.
forget the thoughts. Let's quiet that damn monkey brain and, come back into feeling and perception. And,
Mm-hmm.
in my own experiences with psychedelics and having, my own trips by myself, being able to, be in my body and have this space where I was completely alone, laying there naked, and I realized I was still holding tension.
Mm-hmm.
Just that realization in that altered state of consciousness where the connection to my somatic experience was turned up, I could feel how I was still tense in the body, and just being able to actually relax and let that go and have a breath orgasm and go into the state of ecstasy
Wow.
was really transformative to me. And I think when we're talking about integration, right, how do we take that outside in the world? It is that question of, oh, I'm going through the world. Are my shoulders up by my ears? Oh, okay, okay, okay. Let's drop that. Let's drop that. Let's drop that.
Mm-hmm.
But so much of, the world, and this is where I'm like, Dr. Ruth is cool. I stand on the shoulders of giants, amazing. But when she would talk about sex, she's like, I don't want to get political. And clearly she had an agenda, but would also not be political. But it's like, we can't like go through this world and be looking at people and their sexuality and this inability to notice when the shoulders are up and be like, oh, that's your fault. No, it's fucking capitalism's fault. We are going through a world
Absolutely.
where we are running ragged through this effing system. And so I just want to make sure we're pointing the arrow correctly up at the systems. And that's why we can't be in our
Absolutely.
bodies. I don't want to
Absolutely.
blame the people for this.
No, no, no,
Um,
no, no, we can't. I think our responsibility is, we are responsible for our awareness. You're absolutely right. There's a James Hillman quote that I love to say because I think it's just potent and scary.
yeah.
Because he said something like, we are governed by invisible forces more than we care to believe,
Yes. Yes.
which is terrifying.
Yeah.
right? Because we all want to think like we're in control most of the time. Or if I,
Right.
what's the take control of your life, or you're
Yeah.
driving the car, and like, yeah, yeah, good luck with that one.
Yeah, yeah.
You're driving the car, and then your house burns down, or your partner leaves you,
Mhm.
or you get fired,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
so, right. So the idea that we are not, and our responsibilities in our awareness. I want to go back to what you said because I think it relates, right? So that person I was referencing, she can either leave
Right.
or she can actually do what I think, psychedelics and conscious relationship is like invite her partner into a process, which feels incredibly erotic to me. It's like, hey, I'm going through this change and I'm noticing my change is impacting you this way. Do you want to join me in doing that work together? And that's right what I mean when I say Eros is inviting everybody in the room for a process. It's like, oh, you can transform with me.
Yeah.
Do you want to do that?
Sure. Now I've got a question though.
Go for it.
Because, getting personal over here. Multiple things. Okay, so you're, a psychologist. I'm a psychologist in training. At what point do we say, wow, this emotional labor, your journey is actually so much that I have to leave because this is an unbalanced dynamic? And I think this becomes particularly interesting when you have multiple partnerships, where I'm noticing this world where I don't have to break up with people because personally I'm not in this framework of monogamy, one and, someone fitting in. I'm in a world of relationship anarchy where I have multiple different partners and being able to actually sense in where I'm like, wow, okay, so the emotional labor that you need to do to get to a level of where I'm going, when do I actually close that down and say, wow, I can't go on this journey with you because it's unbalanced? Oh,
Mhm.
oh,
Okay, I want to answer that question, but I'm going to do the therapist thing, and I'm going
okay.
to ask you, when do you do it? And then I'll give you my version.
Well, doctor, I would say that I did just actively do this very recently, and I think that the answer is it doesn't ever feel right. I try to let that go of like that moment where it's like so abundantly clear because I feel like in most of our life it's never that clear. You kind of have to take a little bit of that step and that leap. And then I think about relational cultural theory, and it talks about how you watch the relationships that bring energy into your life, right? And so I think you have to kind of navigate that with new relationship energy and the dopamine cocaine phase of a new relationship because that's complicated and I'm drugged up, But even in this space with you right now, right? Like this conversation is bringing me energy. I'm feeling, like, wow, I could talk to you for hours. Let's go back and forth. And so I think I
Mm,
have to kind of watch that in my world of, okay, have I been spending a lot of time with this person in a way where I come away feeling more drained, more lower? Okay. And you can invite them in and you have a lot of those conversations, but I'm noticing this pattern and oh God, okay, now I need to
mhm,
make this shift and this leap of faith a little to kind of create more space for me to forge other relationships that are bringing me more
mm,
energy into my life. And then to even do that where it's not like a breakup. It's not a full breakup. It's just a shifting of
mm.
how much we're seeing one another or the, appetite I have for this connection is just whoa. Talk about women knowing what they want. This has been the most interesting process for me to go through that exactly and not people please and to form your world of your own
Yeah.
relationships where it's much more complicated. So, doctor, that's what I would say I do.
I appreciate that, doctor. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, you see, that's beautiful because right here we already get into like the nuances of our individual selves. Because when you ask me that question, my answer is the moment where I feel that I have to perpetually abandon myself
Mm,
is the moment I leave.
hmm.
And what do I mean by that? I've been in relationships where the relationship, either unconsciously or non-verbally, the person or the relationship was like, oh, Ido, you can't be this
Oh,
version of yourself. You can't be that. And when I was trying to bring it in and be like, hey, let's do a shared process, it's either met with defensiveness or met with refusal or met
yeah.
with like, I want to, but maybe we are on different trajectories.
Right.
And so for me, if the demand is I have to perpetually abandon who I am in order to be in relationship with you, then we're entering into my red line zone.
Yeah.
Because basically the only thing that's from my experience, either both with work and myself, whatever's going to keep this relationship going is codependency. And that's not a real relationship. I'm going to make myself small so then you don't get upset or I don't feel the fact that we're not a good match in order to keep the relationship. We're not in real relationship.
Yeah.
So for me, it's really about self-abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
For two full beings to really relate, that's a lot. That's a lot. For us to both come in our fullness and our bigness takes a lot of practice, a lot of work, a lot of effort. And there's seasons, right? Some seasons you're going to be more you're going to take more space, and I'm going to be more this. But that's different than, oh, I can't be who I am. This relationship is asking me to not be wild, to not be sexual, I want to start doing this in bed. And there's no willingness. There's no willingness to at least look at their response to see if they want to join me. That's for me, it's like, okay, we need to start asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going in the same direction?
Yeah.
And sadly, one of my mentors used to tell me, I love Lonnie. She said, in her ideal world, couples go to couples therapy when they start dating.
Right. Right. Right.
And the reason she would say that, or at least the reason she shared with me, is she said, we need to normalize the idea that couples working on themselves is a sign of issues, of problems, as opposed to the intimacy space is the space to explore and do the most profound or a version of the most profound self-growth you can do.
Mm-hmm.
You're always going to be in a relationship, right? You know this, you're there. Because we walk with all our dynamics, all our woundings, all our attachments to every place we go. The one thing that I was like, what a gift it is to find someone who wants to do that with you in whatever capacity that looks. Maybe it's your secondary, right? Not your primary partner. Maybe it's a really good intimate friend. Maybe it's your lover. Maybe it's your partner, whatever capacity. What a blessing it is to have someone who's willing to traverse those really beautiful, intense, complex, nuance waters.
Mm-hmm.
Such a beautiful gift.
Yeah. It's a real psychedelic, you hold.
It is absolutely.
Yeah.
I say this to a lot of people who come to me like, hey, I want to do psychedelics with my partner. And I'm like, how psychedelic are you on a day-to-day level? Like, when is the last time you had a real conversation with each other?
Yeah.
And you see the faces go like, oh, uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
We did a study this year that I'm writing now about couples who use psychedelics for their relationship.
Cool. Love that. Yeah.
And it was beautiful. Like we had most of the 70% of the couples talked about how in the experience, there was a lot more freedom to be what we call vulnerable self-disclosure. We call it vulnerable self-disclosure exploratory. It's not just me telling you something. And it can be from emotional processing of trauma to something that I'm carrying to touch, you couples doing these really intense eye gazing experiences with each other and having these really personal experiences. 70% of them do like sensory practices, which are not about sex.
Sure.
So they
Great.
feed each other.
Yeah.
And they described in vivid detail how, my God, it was so beautiful to see her like get pleasure, to see him get pleasure from me feeding him, to feel texture, to take humming sexual, right, out of the field.
Right.
And all of a sudden, there's no pressure.
Right.
She talks about something that I'm curious, maybe we can talk a little bit about, this idea of performance. So here's societal structures coming in again. But what was interesting is that less than 30% of them took the experience forward.
Sad.
But it's a metaphor, right? It's not, maybe not it's a microcosm of what happens in relationships. Have peak experiences. So I think we're advocating for like conscious relationships, because you can create psychedelic experiences very sober. Your adrenaline starts to spike when you talk about that uncomfortable thing. You start releasing all those endorphins, all those, and lo and behold, woof, we're both altered.
Mm-hmm.
And can we allow ourselves to kind of enter that space?
Yeah.
I read this beautiful and accurate, for me, description of intimacy it said, the ability to let someone into you and while they create impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the highlight was creating impact. So it's not about just like being open. It's like, can you let someone in? Which we can already hear, right? The subtle sexual hints. Can you let someone in? both ways, and can you be impacted?
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about that, it terrifies me and excites me profoundly.
Sure.
Like, yes. What's your definition of intimacy?
Oof. The ineffable. Maybe I don't even want to go there. Maybe I don't even want to hit it like that, right? I do like what you just shared, right? Because I think that that is accurate and maybe more expansive than we even think. And I think could maybe help people to start see the impact of relationships in general, right? It's hard for me where I get back into this world where I don't care whether you're monogamous, poly, relationship, I don't care. Like you have multiple relationships and those relationships impact you. And so when people are like, I have one relationship, I'm like, okay, we got to start with ABCs here of just like, you have multiple. And so intimacy, right? And that act of letting someone in, whether it's a family member, a friend, a mentor, you are letting them in and they are impacting you. And so we have intimacy across the board with multiple people. And I think that if we got into that world of understanding that, we would maybe take more intentionality to those relationships. We'd also feel more fulfilled because we wouldn't be in this world of, I'm single until I get this one relationship and think that intimacy and romance is so locked up there compared to, wow, like, my mentor, my supervisors exist in my psyche. And when they're proud of me,
Mm,
I feel good about me. And so I'm letting them in and they're impacting me. And that is intimacy in and of itself. And I think
mm,
hopefully we can get to a world where more of that is possible. And part of that then is letting go of these ideas of performance, right? Because if you're doing the mask and the script and this is what it is, you're not letting anybody in, but god damn is that vulnerable. God damn is that
mm,
scary to be like, hey, I'm gonna tell you about this tender part of myself and I hope you don't judge me, right? And then they might. And then you have to make that decision of, okay, do I let this in? Do I move away? What do I do about that? Because I just
mm,
opened up about this very tender part of myself. And for me, play has been that. Like, play has been a
mm,
tender part for me because I think, particularly with sexuality and just life in general, my God, I was so analytical. I was like, I know the answers. I took physics in college. I know the answers, the answers. God forbid I
mm,
write creatively. That is, what is the answer there, right? So let's pull that into the bedroom. Okay, I've seen porn. I've seen this. I know the answers of how to do this, how to
mm,
show up. And so what does it mean to get into a world of play? Oof, tricky. And so when you were talking about partners and psychedelics, I was just remembering my last experience with one of my partners where it wasn't sexual at all, but we were just wrapped up in one another and making funny sounds like kids, just like
mhm,
wiggling the body and going, hee hee, and then like bouncing back off of each other and going back and forth. And I felt like I was 5 years old, just like giggling
mm.
with this person and creating this playful dynamic where they talk about play not having a goal, right? And so you have to be in that state of letting go of the psyche to just be in the moment and let it flow, which was what was happening. I was just letting these sounds come out of my mouth and my body, again, not sexual, but just letting it come out without
Yeah.
thinking about it. And in that, I think I reached a level of play that when we came back into our
Mm,
ordinary states of consciousness directly translated into the ways that we were being intimate with one another. It just created
mm.
more space to roar in a way that I haven't had access to in a lot of capacities.
That's beautiful. It's so vulnerable, right? It's so funny to think about play being so, that level of play being so vulnerable.
Right.
Mm. But
Right.
that you're saying something really, I think, profound, which is what are the conditions I need to get out of my head right? For me, the word as I'm listening to you is to allow. The way I think about, okay, so this is another beautiful expression of Eros. Like that's what we felt. That's what Eros wanted. It's like we're gonna sit here and giggle.
Right.
As we're like, intertwined and cuddled into each other. We're just gonna giggle. And then, oh, lo and behold, I'm 5. And that's great. Maybe this kind of brings it a little bit like full circle, but can I feel safe enough inside of myself to show up so I'm not dependent on you for safety? I always tell this to people at work. The issue with fear, I don't believe in being fearless. I don't think it's possible. But the issue with possession of fear is that you don't give yourself the opportunity to see that there is maybe something that you haven't thought about. on the other side of fear. Maybe you are going to make those sounds and your partner is going to love it. Because that's going to be, excuse me, a mind fuck, right? Because
Yeah.
fear is saying, like, no, protection, reject.
Right.
We can't be rejected.
Right.
Don't. And all of a sudden, I get a positive experience, like, how do I digest this?
Mm-hmm.
Do I just all of a sudden partnering with someone who's like, oh, tell me all about your sexual fantasies. I want to know
Right.
them as we're like laying naked in bed.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a whole thing for my system. Sometimes we need that carrot to be like, okay, how do I walk with my fears? You know, especially I think when it comes to psychedelics and these more or any sexual conscious relationship practices, I think there is a way in which messages are like, don't be fearless, don't be fearful, be shameless. And I'm like, that's so much work. Don't do that. Don't worry about that. Take your fear, walk with it. Take your shame and bring it into bed. You know, that's the beauty of sensuality. I feel ashamed with you, but I use that as a stop sign. And I'm like, wait, I feel a lot of shame right now. And you're like, okay, great. I'm going to hang out here with you,
Yeah.
which is already de-shaming.
Right.
Shame is saying, well, who wants to hang out with you? Look how horrible you are. So
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden, Nicole is like, no, I'm right here.
Yeah.
And then we giggle like 5 years
Right.
old.
Right.
And
Right. Right. But that just makes me think about, again, the intricacies of this not being an individual process. We can do
Mhm.
all we want to be, okay, I'm internal. I'm not going to judge myself. I'm not going to judge myself. And then you come to someone and you bring it and they go, what the fuck are you talking about? And then you're like, oh no, and that's how the therapeutic relationship works, right? The safety and container that
Mhm.
becomes a model for other relationships, right? It's just so hard if you've been stuck in a container in a relationship where you are judged, where you are these things, and how like you need other relationships where that is okay, where that is celebrated, where that is held for you to get out of that space. And if you just keep thinking, I'm going to let this go on my own, it doesn't work like
Absolutely.
that.
It doesn't work that way. And, you know, I would just add that you need those relationships. And if for whoever's going to listen, also want to encourage like practice saying it anyway,
Yeah.
right? Practice. And what I mean by that is practice being the creator. If you want that in a relationship, right? So we're back into the safety risk. Take a
Right.
risk,
Right.
take the risk. You know, on some level, I say this only to my couples when I work with them for a while. I'm like, the thing they fear the most is not rejection, it's the truth.
Mm.
We fear that if I come and I start telling you, you know what, Nicole, I guess I have like a really kinky part of myself that I've never explored. My fear is not that you're going to reject it. The fear underneath is that you're going to be like, I don't want to be with you. That's the truth. And if you don't want to be with me and we're married for 20 years and we have kids to raise, that's going to be a really earth-shattering change for both of us.
Mm-hmm.
So most of us are pushing away against that truth. And then what we're doing is what we said, we're oppressing, repressing ourselves throughout on a weekly basis. But if I can become the creator and start introducing those things into our relationship, like, hey, this is what I want, or hey, I'm noticing that I told you what I want, and all of a sudden you're withdrawn, right? I'm introducing the level of consciousness I want, the level of intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
That on its own can be liberating. Right? It's such a nuanced dance of how do I stay differentiated enough to be a full person and close enough for us to have like profound intimacy.
Yeah, the dance, right? And I think that's found in multiple relationships. Again,
Mhm.
not talking about this in a monogamy or polyamorous bifurcation. I'm talking about friendships. I'm talking about all of it. I'm talking about you find that in multiple relationships, right? I have a quote on one of my post-it notes from In a Different Voice, which is a book from feminist psychology. And it says, we know ourselves as separate only insofar as we live in connection with others, and that we experience relationship only insofar as we differentiate other from the self. And just that
Mm.
like literally that dance
Mm.
of it's that yes and to it. And when I think about differentiating in terms of the individual, I think it's so important for people to have a relationship to their sexuality that is independent of others, right? And
Mm.
I think about that culturally too, and particularly like my family and the Mormonism culture and like the rules in that culture against masturbation and self sex acts and
Mm.
stuff. So I'm holding that as I say this now, and the importance of the self eroticism, but I do think that even in these worlds, you still look out in the world and you see what turns you on, maybe a person, maybe this or that. So I think we all should have that. And in a world where you're not in that culture, I think there's so much beauty into looking in a mirror and do I find myself attractive? And if not,
Mm,
maybe we can start there before we even think about the partner, before we even think about the other people. Why is it that when I look into the mirror, I'm not interested in myself? Oof.
mm. Oh, you're sending people right into the like the the heart of the matter. I love it.
Take the
Um,
psychedelic, look in the mirror, and come talk to us.
I was I was just about to say they say never look in the mirror in the beginning, and you're sitting right into the mirror. Oh,
Whoa.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
I remember what it was a Netflix show about this sexologist who, when you first come meet her, you sit naked as a
Love
woman
that.
in front of a
Yeah.
mirror.
Yeah.
I think most of us, when we look at our body, we don't see our body. We see societal view of our body. Because I'm already comparing myself to some kind of standard of attraction and masculinity and da 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 da. And what you're talking for me is next level of, can I come to a place where I can work to get to to an objective view of myself. And I look at myself and just see myself for who I am before I label it as pretty, not pretty, attractive, not attractive, which is a very tall order of consciousness and a very necessary. Can you reclaim your body?
Yeah, and I think again, going back into this dance that we're talking about, right, of the ways of the individual and the society and the people,
Hmm.
I'm just thinking about how for the holidays I got my friends passes to go into this spa that we all went to. And it has this community space. It was gendered, but it had this community space where all of the women could go into the bath and it was all naked. And wow, what an experience to be able to look around and see women of so many different body types, so many
Mm,
different ages, so many different nipple colors and shapes and cellulite and everything. And just to have this moment of like, oh, yeah, I am beautiful and I fit in the spectrum
mm,
of this diversity of all of these different bodies. And I think this then brings me back to the ideas of the archetypes, right? What do you see in the media? What do you see in porn? And how we are constantly, because we're social creatures, looking to that, but then specifically lacking the cultural spaces where we can go to be naked and have this experience to look around and be like, oh, okay, I'm actually really normal. This diversity is very, very normal. So then we're thinking about the puritanical roots again, right? Where within our culture of America, that's such a rarity to find that sort of space where I can actually go and be naked in a non-sexual manner and have that
mm,
freedom space. So it's like, yeah, look into the mirror, take the psychedelic and do it. And also the difficulty that you experience is not just your fault, right? This is again the arrow up towards the systems where we don't have spaces where I can do that. I don't have representation. And so it's that nuanced dance of the yes and I think to all of
yeah,
this.
yeah. You're making me think about there's this hot spring center around 3 hours north of where I'm at, where it's new.
Cool.
Oh yeah, yeah. California is really good.
California is, yeah.
You should come over.
Yeah, I
Um,
should.
but I remember going there, and what for me was most interesting is noticing my inner ageism.
Yeah.
There is something so beautiful about what you're saying. It can help us not just accept the multiplicity of what beauty is, but also the really maybe transpersonal idea that we're all going to become everything. You're going to be beautiful one day and you're going to be more full body. And one day you will be old. Right. And I think for me, it was really fascinating because it made me really see how my idea of sexuality was in a way frozen, as opposed to the idea that sexuality is this vibrant organism that morphs all the time.
Right.
I am not the same sexual being I was 5 years ago, thank God,
No.
or 20 years ago. Which is, I think that I always love the studies that show that the age that enjoy sex most are like the golden years. People who are
Yeah.
65 and above report the most amount of pleasure from sex. And I think probably if we read it, a lot of it is about because they have a fuck that mentality about
Yep.
looks.
Yep.
We're all saggy and like then wrinkled and like all that societal stuff we're talking about, those suits are kind of,
Mm-hmm.
can we reach into the future and bring that here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was, I think, one of the biggest stretches, expansions for me when I stepped into the dungeon and I saw
Hmm.
people that were flogging well into the 60s, 70s. And I was like, oh, yeah, people do this. Oh, yeah, and I'd never been in a sexual space where I could see that other than the dungeon. And
Uh-huh.
it was such
Yeah.
a it was such an experience just to be there in that moment and watch that and think, yeah, that will be me one day. That will be me in that vitality.
Hmm.
And again, cultural scripts, the Golden Bachelor, right? Like all this sort of, I'm so happy that that exists with all of the problematic nature of whatever we want to say about it all. It's creating a huge experience for the psyche to imagine a whole new
Yeah.
world because it's a new script.
Yeah.
And I'm so excited for that. We have to celebrate these things for the beauty that they are, right? And so I am hoping that as we continue to step into a world that embraces more pleasure, let's go of the shame. Part of this will be the discussion. What does sex after 60 look like, right? What
Mm.
does sex and connection to myself look like? What is this edge of intimacy and vulnerability? And God, that is so hot. How fucking hot is it when you're in that vulnerable edge and you're on the same page and you see one another? Like, God, it's so beautiful. And I think people forget that, it's like this idea of sex of like the dungeon and the whips and the aggression. And it's like, my God, when we have a deep conversation and we're on the same page and I see you looking into me, mm, mm,
Mm.
mm,
Mm.
mm. Like, wow.
Chocolate dessert. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's yeah. I don't have anything to add. I'm just relishing in the deliciousness of what you just said.
Good. We can stay there.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. When I came to the United States 13 years ago, in the context of what we're talking, the two main things I noticed was one, why do Americans, every opportunity, every Halloween, every festival, the first thing they do is get naked?
Yep.
Like, what's that about? Given my embodied experience was how puritanical and repressive. And I was like, oh, this is a very interesting clash that I'm noticing. And the second thing was there's an annual fair in San Francisco called the Folsom Street Fair, which is basically a celebration of all queer, BDSM, every sexual. And so people are basically having sex in the streets in any version. And I remember having a similar experience to you, like, oh, wow, look at the wide array
Right.
of ages, bodies, diverse connections. This shape with that object. And this twosome with that third thing on that contraption. And just seeing my structures kind of like collapse and expand at the same time.
Yep.
I think what you're saying and what we're saying is a really good place to start practice. Like expose yourself to things that are gonna help you both disintegrate and expand.
Hmm.
And don't worry, I always tell people, if you want to integrate, if you want to grow, you have to disintegrate first. It
Yeah.
doesn't work any other way,
Yeah.
right? You can't keep shoving things inside without deconstructing the thing that's trying to keep you the same way.
As painful as that is.
It feels, it feels liberating. As someone who, my house burned down last year,
Oh, wow.
95% of my belongings.
Oof. Oof.
I know. You see, so that's an interesting response. Because my experience of it was, don't get me wrong, it was logistical nightmare and the huge financial loss. But on a deep level, I could see why it was extremely necessary. And the disintegration was less painful than I thought it would be. It brought the space I needed to actually bring the truth and structures I actually wanted.
Right. Yeah. That freedom, that space. Yeah.
The space. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I can be a beautiful butterfly in the space, right, in terms of just thinking about what you're talking about of disintegrating and letting go and having that expansion, the tears that I had on that floor about having sex before marriage and all of the ways that I've cried along this journey to get to where I'm at now, where at the beginning I was like, oh, I don't have shame, right? That took
Mm.
so many stretching moments of disintegration where I was so confused. And I, not to say that orgasms are the center of existence, of course, but I will say to get to a space of multi-orgasmic pleasure for all of that, I'm really happy that I disintegrated all of those things and all of that journey. So I hope that I'm excited to see at 70 what's going on up in this body over here. It's gonna be good.
Hopefully, we will do another podcast when you're 70.
Totally, totally. Well, yeah, because even when you're talking about like a Mardi Gras power flip, right? We get naked. Then I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, well, see, this is fascinating, right? Because then that creates the psyche where it's fun to play with these things. How much of our interests sexually are so shaped by the culture and these power dynamics that we don't even notice that are
Mm.
constant. And then I'm like, okay, that's hour 3 of the pot. Like I gotta cut myself off at some point from our exploration.
Okay, okay.
Because I could just
Okay,
keep
we should do that because you
going.
just triggered a whole other thing
I
for me about how
know.
I see those spaces as like, I always find Halloween fascinating because I think it's
Yeah,
like the permission for your actual inner archetype to come out.
sure.
It's like, okay, this is what's actually, so anyway,
Topsy
another
turvy, the
podcast.
dungeon. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Here
Yes,
we
all of
go.
it,
Here we
all
go.
of it.
Well, I will hold some space first before I close. I always like to check in just to make sure there wasn't anything on your heart that we didn't hit that you want to share with the listeners.
Mm.
Otherwise, I can guide us towards a closing question.
No, there's a lot more to say, but I feel
I know.
yeah.
Okay, good, good, good. All right. Well, the closing question that I ask every guest is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
Mm. The most attractive part of you is probably the thing you think is the most weird.
Mm. Oof. Simmer in that one. So learning to have the spaces where you can express that and have that be seen and, just pinning back to everything we've been talking about, the expansion, the pleasure that comes from opening up about those more sensitive, vulnerable parts of ourselves.
Absolutely. And the person who's gonna really like your weirdness is probably the person you want to hang out
Yeah. Isn't that a fun projective question? I just love, as a psychologist,
with.
I'm
It's
sure
a
you,
great question.
yeah, you
It's a
understand.
great
I'm like,
question.
where are they gonna take this one? Like it's really open door. Well, it has been such a pleasure to have you on the
Mm,
podcast. Thank you for
thank you for having
co-creating
me.
this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where do you want to plug for people who are connecting with you, want to learn more about your work?
Sure. So the best place to reach me is either on my email, which is Ido Cohen, Cohen .therapy at gmail.com, Instagram, same thing, Dr. Ido Cohen, or the Integration Circle on Instagram too.
Great. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. That was so fun. So thank you. I'll cut it
Yeah.
there. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.